He always sat in the same chair, third row from the front, on the left side, close enough to the aisle that he could see her face clearly when she walked out under the lights. The auditorium was nearly empty around him that evening, the way it so often was for the small midweek recitals, the ones that didn't make it onto the family calendars of busier households. Rows of wooden folding chairs stretched out in every direction, most of them holding nothing but the soft amber glow that spilled from the stage. Daniel didn't mind the empty seats. He had grown used to them. He folded his coat across his lap, smoothed it once with his palm, and settled in with the patient stillness of a man who had learned to wait, to watch, to be present without needing to be noticed. The warm stage light fell across his tired face, and though the lines around his eyes were deeper now than they had been a few years ago, there was a quiet pride in them, a softness that no exhaustion could fully wear away. He was 46 years old, a man who worked long hours with his hands and longer hours with his heart. And when the curtains shifted and the first notes drifted out into that hollow room, his whole body leaned forward, just slightly, the way a flower turns toward the sun without ever deciding to. There she was, his daughter, 8 years old, in a simple white dress, her small fingers trembling against the strings of a violin that was almost too big for her. The sound she made was not perfect. A note wavered, a bow scraped, but to Daniel, sitting alone in the third row, it was the most beautiful music ever written. More moving than any orchestra, more precious than any song he had ever heard on the radio during those long drives home from work. He clasped his hands together to keep from clapping too soon, and he watched her with an attention so complete that the rest of the world simply ceased to exist. No one else had come tonight. No grandparents in the back. No mother in the front row with a camera, just him, and a handful of strangers scattered through the dim, and the small girl on stage, who kept glancing out into the dark searching. He knew what she was looking for. She was looking for him. Then every single time her eyes swept across those empty rows, they found him exactly where she knew he would be, and her shoulders would relax and she would breathe and she would play on. That was the promise he had made to her, silently, the night everything changed in their lives. He would show up. Whatever it took, however tired he was, however alone he felt, he would be in that chair. Because a child should never have to look out into the dark and find no one looking back. Daniel had grown up that way himself, and he had carried the ache of it his entire life, the memory of recitals and ball games and parent days, where he had searched the crowd and found only the absence of the people who were supposed to be there. He had sworn, the day she was born, that his little girl would never know that particular kind of loneliness, and so he sat, alone but unbreakable, tired but unmoved. The amber light warming his face, his proud and weary eyes fixed on the only thing in the world that mattered to him. And when she finished her piece and lowered her bow, he was the first to clap, his hands coming together with a sound that filled the whole quiet room, loud enough for 10 people, loud enough to make sure she heard it, loud enough to say across all that empty space, "I am here, I saw you, I will always be here." After the applause faded and the small audience began to gather their coats, Daniel stayed seated a moment longer, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket for the thing he always carried. It was a single sheet of paper, folded into quarters, soft now at the creases from being opened and closed so many times. The concert program. She had made it herself, his daughter, with the help of her music teacher, and on the front she had drawn a little violin in purple crayon, and written the words, "Winter Recital," in her careful, looping letters that still drifted slightly uphill, no matter how hard she tried. His weathered hands unfolded it slowly, the way a man might handle something fragile and irreplaceable, and he rested it on the worn denim of his jeans, smoothing the page beneath the warm tungsten light that hung overhead. He had a stack of these at home, dozens of them, every recital, every winter concert, every spring showcase, every little classroom performance, going back years. He kept them all in an old shoebox on the top shelf of his closet. And sometimes late at night, when the house was quiet and sleep wouldn't come, he would take that box down and sort through them, reading the programs and remembering each performance, the way she had looked, the song she had played, the expression on her face when she finished. To anyone else, they would have been worthless scraps of paper. To Daniel, they were a kind of scripture, the recorded history of a promise being kept one evening at a time. His thumb traced the purple violin on the cover, and he thought, as he often did, about the road that had brought them here, just the two of them. He thought about the morning her mother had left, the suitcase by the door, the way the silence in the house had felt so heavy he could barely breathe. He thought about standing in the kitchen afterward with a 3-year-old on his hip, completely unsure of how he was going to do this. How a man who barely knew how to braid hair or pack a lunchbox was going to raise a little girl all by himself. He had been so afraid back then, afraid he would get it wrong, afraid he wasn't enough, afraid that the absence of a mother would leave a hole in her that he could never hope to fill. And yet here they were, 5 years on, and his daughter had grown into the bravest, gentlest, most determined little person he had ever known. She played the violin because she had heard a song once on the radio, and announced with the fierce certainty of a 4-year-old that she was going to make music like that someday. And Daniel, who could not afford much, had found a way. He had taken extra shifts. He had bought a second-hand instrument from a man 2 towns over, and driven through a snowstorm to get it. He had sat beside her through every screeching, scraping, agonizing early lesson without once flinching, telling her she sounded wonderful, even when she didn't, because he knew that what she needed most was not honesty about the music, but faith in herself. He folded the program again now, carefully, along its familiar creases, and tucked it back into his jacket pocket close to his chest. The auditorium was empty now, the last family gone, the stage lights humming softly above. He stood, his knees aching the way they did these days, and he made his way toward the side door, where she would be waiting with her violin case clutched against her, her cheeks flushed with the leftover thrill of having played for a crowd, even a small crowd. Even just for him. And that, Daniel thought, was the whole of his life, now folded down into a single creased page he would never let go of. The mornings were his favorite. Long before the school bell and the lunch packing and the rush of the day, there was that soft golden hour, just after sunrise, when the kitchen filled with cream and honey light, and his daughter would stand by the window in her recital dress, the white one she insisted on wearing whenever she practiced because she said it made her feel like a real musician. Her name was Lily, and at 8 years old she had a way of holding her violin. That was all seriousness, her small chin tucked, her brow furrowed in concentration, her bare feet planted on the cool kitchen tile. Daniel would lean against the doorway with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and he would watch her play, and he would let the whole world wait. There was nowhere he needed to be that was more important than this. The morning light caught the dust, drifting in the air, and turned it to gold, and it landed on Lily's hair, and on the curve of her cheek, and on the worn wood of that second-hand violin, and Daniel thought he had never seen anything so beautiful in all his life. She was working on a difficult piece, one her teacher had given her to challenge her, and she kept stumbling over the same passage, the same 3 notes that wouldn't come out right, no matter how many times she tried. He watched her stop, frustrated, her bow dropping to her side, her shoulders slumping. "Daddy," she said without turning around, because she had known he was there the whole time, the way she always did. "I can't do this part. It's too hard." And Daniel set his coffee down on the counter and crossed the kitchen and knelt down beside her, even though his knees protested, and he looked at the sheet music with her, though he could not read a note of it himself. He had learned long ago that he didn't need to understand the music to understand his daughter. "You don't have to get it right this morning," he told her gently. "You just have to keep showing up to it. That's the whole secret, sweetheart. You keep coming back, day after day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, and one morning you'll wake up, and your fingers will just know it." Lily looked up at him with those wide brown eyes that were so much like her own mother's that it sometimes ached to look at them, and she asked him the question she asked in some form nearly every day. "Is that what you do, Daddy? Do you keep showing up?" And Daniel felt his throat tighten, the way it always did, and he smoothed the stray hair back from her face and said every single day, "Baby, every single day, for you." She nodded, satisfied, and lifted the violin back to her chin, and she tried the passage again, and this time she got one more note than before, and her face lit up like the morning sun itself. "That's it," Daniel breathed. "That's my girl!" And he stayed there kneeling beside her on the kitchen floor as she played the same 3 notes over and over, getting a little better each time, the golden light pouring in around them, the smell of toast and coffee in the air, the radio playing softly in the next room. These were the moments no one ever saw. The moments that didn't make it onto any program or into any photograph. The quiet, ordinary mornings that were the true foundation of everything they had built together. The recitals were lovely, but they were only the visible tip of a far deeper thing. A love that was poured out in toast crusts and tangled hair and patient mornings by the window. Daniel knew that he would forget many things as he grew old. But he prayed. He would never forget the sight of his daughter in her white dress, chasing those 3 difficult notes through the gold of an ordinary morning. The drive home from her lessons always fell at the edge of evening, when the sky bruised purple and orange over the rooftops and the streetlights flickered on, one by one. Daniel drove slowly, the dashboard glowing soft amber in front of him, the heater ticking, the road unspooling ahead through the windshield in muted tones of dusk. In the back seat sat her little backpack, the purple one with the worn straps, and beside it her violin case, buckled carefully shut. Lily had fallen asleep before they'd even left the parking lot, the way she often did after a long day, her head tipped against the window, her mouth slightly open, exhausted from the effort of being 8 years old and learning to make music and carrying the weight of a world that asked so much of such a small person. Daniel glanced at her in the mirror, at every red light, just to see her face, just to reassure himself that she was real, safe, and his. These quiet drives were where he did his thinking, where the worries he kept hidden during daylight hours rose up to keep him company in the dark. He worried about money the way he always did, about the lessons that cost more than he could really afford, about the new shoes she needed, and the field trip permission slip with the fee he'd had to think twice about. He worried about whether he was enough, whether a man alone could truly give a little girl everything she needed, whether there were things only a mother could provide that he was failing to even recognize. He worried about the future, about the day she would grow up and grow away, about whether he was building her strong enough to survive a world that had not been gentle with him. But mostly in these amber-lit moments, he worried about whether she felt loved enough, whether all his showing up, all his quiet presence in the back of empty auditoriums actually reached her, whether she knew. He thought about how the other children at her school had 2 parents, sometimes more, a whole crowd of relatives showing up to clap and cheer. He thought about how Lily was the only one at her recitals with just a single tired man in the 3rd row. He wondered if it embarrassed her, if she ever wished he could be more, do more, be a bigger crowd all by himself. The thought put an ache in his chest that the heater could not warm away. At a stoplight, Lily stirred in the back seat and murmured something in her sleep, and Daniel reached back instinctively and rested his hand on her knee just for a moment, just to feel the warmth of her, and she settled again. The light turned green, and he drove on through the quiet town, past the diner, where they sometimes split a plate of pancakes on Sunday mornings, past the park where he pushed her on the swings, past the hardware store where he worked 5.5 days a week to keep the small life they had patched together from falling apart. He had given up a great deal for this life. Friends had drifted away over the years, the way friends do when a man's whole world narrows to a single child. He rarely went out. He could not remember the last time he had done anything purely for himself. But he did not feel sorry for it, not for a single second. Because everything he had given up, he had given up for the small sleeping passenger in his back seat, and that was the best bargain a man could ever make. He pulled into their driveway as the last light drained from the sky, and he sat for a moment with the engine off and the silence settling around him, looking at her in the mirror, gathering himself before he carried her inside. My girl, he thought, my whole entire heart asleep in the back seat. He would do it all again, 1,000 times over. He would never stop. Sunday afternoons belonged to the couch and the sheet music. It was their ritual. The two of them. After church and lunch and the dishes, when the light came slanting through the living room window in long pale ribbons of beige and cream, they would sit side by side on the old couch, the one with the worn arm where the fabric had gone thin from years of use, and they would spread the sheet music across both their laps, sharing it, even though only one of them could read it. Lily would point to the notes and explain them to him patiently, the way her teacher explained them to her, and Daniel would nod along with great seriousness, asking questions, getting things wrong on purpose, sometimes just to hear her laugh and correct him. "This is a quarter note, Daddy," she would say, "and that's a whole note. See, it's open in the middle, and you hold it longer." And Daniel would squint at the page and say, "So, the fat, empty ones you hold, and the skinny, full ones you let go fast." And Lily would giggle and say, "Sort of," and lean against his arm. He loved these afternoons more than he could say. There was something so tender about the matching concentration on their two faces, his weathered and lined, hers small and smooth, both furrowed in the same way over the same mysterious language of dots and lines. He could not give her music lessons himself. He could not teach her the violin, or correct her bowing, or hum the melodies in tune, but he could sit beside her. He could learn alongside her, slowly and clumsily, so that she never felt alone in the strange country of music she was traveling through. He had decided long ago that this was the kind of father he would be, not the kind who knew everything, but the kind who showed up to learn it with her. On this particular Sunday, Lily was quiet for a while, tracing the notes with her small finger, and then she said, in the careful way she said things that had been turning over in her mind, "Daddy, at school, Sophia's mom and dad both came to the fall concert. And her grandma and her aunt." Daniel felt the familiar ache rise in his chest, but he kept his voice easy. "Is that right?" he said. "That's a lot of people for one little Sophia." And Lily nodded and was quiet again, and then she said the thing he had been afraid of for years, "Why do we only have you?" And Daniel set the sheet music aside and turned to face his daughter fully, and he took both of her small hands in his big rough ones, and he thought very carefully about how to answer, because he knew this moment mattered, knew she would carry whatever he said now for the rest of her life. "Sweetheart," he said, "some families are big and loud and full of lots of people, and that's a beautiful thing. And some families are small and quiet, just two people, and that's a beautiful thing too. What matters isn't how many chairs are filled. What matters is whether the people who love you show up. And I will always, always show up." Lily looked at him, weighing this, the way she weighed everything, and then she asked, "But don't you get lonely sitting by yourself at all my concerts?" And the question nearly broke him, because she was only 8, and yet she had seen straight through to the truth of him, had noticed his loneliness, even as he tried to hide it. He squeezed her hands and he said, "When I'm watching you, I'm the least lonely man in the whole world. You fill up that whole room for me, every empty seat in it. Do you understand?" And she nodded slowly, and then she crawled into his lap, too big for it now, but neither of them caring. And they sat together in the cream-colored light while the sheet music slid forgotten to the floor, and Daniel held his daughter and thought that he had never told a truer thing in all his life. There was a wall in their kitchen that Daniel thought of as the most important wall in the house. It was the side of the old refrigerator, and over the years it had become a kind of shrine to his daughter's life. Crayon drawings hung there, curling at the edges, held up by mismatched magnets shaped like fruit and letters, and one lonely rubber duck. There were report cards and spelling tests with gold stars, and a finger painting of what was either a horse or a dog, and a photograph of the two of them at the county fair with cotton candy stuck to their cheeks. And tucked among all of it, in a place of honor along the freezer door, was a growing collection of concert ticket stubs and programs, every single one Daniel had ever attended, taped up carefully so Lily could see them whenever she opened the fridge for a glass of milk. On this evening, after another recital, Daniel stood at the refrigerator in the warm kitchen light, pinning up a new edition. Lily had made it for him that afternoon, a paper star cut from yellow construction paper, slightly lopsided, with the words, "For my daddy, my #1 fan," written across it in marker. She had pressed it into his hands after the concert and said, "This is for showing up," and Daniel had not trusted himself to speak. Now he found a clear spot among the drawings and the ticket stubs, and he pinned the paper star up with great care, stepping back to make sure it was straight, the warm light glowing behind him. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at the whole collage of their life together, this wall that told the story of a father and daughter who had built something real out of very little. Every stub was a promise kept. Every drawing was an ordinary evening turned into something worth saving. He thought about how, when she was grown and gone, this wall would still be here, in his memory, this golden patchwork of a childhood he had given everything to protect. From the other room he could hear Lily getting ready for bed, the water running, her humming the melody she played that night, slightly off-key, completely happy. Daniel reached out and touched one of the older drawings, a stick figure family she'd made in kindergarten. Just 2 stick figures, a big one and a little one, holding stick hands under a yellow sun, and over them she had written the single word, home. He remembered the day she brought it home, how the teacher had pulled him aside, gently, to ask if everything was all right, whether Lily had drawn only 2 people because something was wrong. And Daniel had looked at the drawing and felt a complicated rush of pride and grief and fierce love, and he had said, "No, that's exactly right, that's exactly our family," and he had taped it to the fridge that very night. He never wanted her to feel that 2 was not enough. He wanted her to grow up believing that their small family was complete, was whole, was lacking nothing. And looking at the new paper star, now, the lopsided yellow thing that said #1 fan, he believed she did. He believed, on his good days at least, that he had managed it, that he had filled the house with so much love that the empty chairs and the missing mother had never been able to take root and grow into something bitter inside her. He turned off the kitchen light, leaving the wall in soft darkness, all those memories settling into the shadows like sleeping children. And he went to tuck his daughter into bed, carrying the warmth of the kitchen with him, the warmth of a life that, for all its struggle, was rich beyond measuring in the only currency that ever truly mattered. But there were nights when the loneliness caught up to him, nights like the spring showcase, the big one, when the auditorium had been full of families and laughter and flashing cameras, and Daniel had sat in his usual chair surrounded by clusters of people who all seemed to belong to someone. He had clapped for Lily, and clapped for the other children too. And when it was over he had stayed in his seat as the room emptied out, still applauding softly into the dimming light, his hands coming together long after everyone else had stopped, because somehow he could not make himself rise and join the river of complete families flowing toward the doors. The stage lights faded down to a soft golden wash, and Daniel sat slumped a little in the wooden chair, tired in his bones, watching the last few parents shepherd their children up the aisle, listening to the cheerful chatter of plans being made, of ice cream stops and grandparents to call and group photos to take. No one spoke to him. No one ever did, really. He was the quiet man in the 3rd row, the one who came alone, And over the years he had become almost invisible to the other parents, a fixture as familiar and unremarked as the chairs themselves. He did not blame them. He had never been good at small talk, and the weight of his days left little room for forging friendships at school events. But on nights like this, in the dimming gold of the emptying hall, he felt the full size of his solitude, and it pressed down on him like a great soft hand. He thought about how it would feel to have someone beside him in these moments. Someone to turn to and say, "Did you see her up there? Wasn't she wonderful? Can you believe that's our girl?" Someone to share the swelling pride that he carried entirely alone, that had no other home but his own chest. He thought about Lily's mother, somewhere out in the world, who had never seen a single one of these concerts, who did not know that her daughter played the violin, who had no idea what she had walked away from. He did not hate her. He had stopped hating her years ago, because hatred was a weight he could not afford to carry while also carrying a child. But on nights like this, he allowed himself a small private grief, a quiet mourning for the partnership that should have existed, for the empty chair beside him that should have held someone who loved Lily as fiercely as he did. Then, as always, he pulled himself back. He straightened in his seat and wiped at his eyes with the back of his weathered hand, and reminded himself of the only truth that ever steadied him. He was not staying away. That was the thing. Whatever else he lacked, whatever he could not give her, he was here. He had stayed. So many fathers, his own included, had found reasons to be elsewhere, to drift off, to let the distance grow until it swallowed everything. But Daniel had planted himself in this town, and this little house, and this third-row seat, and he had refused to move, year after year, recital after recital, through exhaustion and loneliness, and the long, quiet ache of doing it all by himself. There was a kind of heroism in simply not leaving, he had come to believe, a quiet, unglamorous heroism that no one ever clapped for. And so he sat, alone, in the dimming gold, a moment longer, and then he stood, his joints aching, and he made his way down to the side door to collect his daughter, who would come running to him with her face full of light, and the loneliness would melt away in the warmth of her small body crashing into his, and he would remember all over again exactly why he stayed. When the showcase ended that night, the school had mostly emptied out, and Daniel and Lily found themselves walking together down the long, main hallway, just the two of them, the way it so often was. The corridor stretched out ahead, lit in soft pools of warm amber from the overhead lights, with cool blue shadows gathering in the corners, where the evening had crept in through the tall windows. Lily held his hand, her small fingers wrapped tight around two of his, and in her other hand she carried her violin case, and as they walked, it swung gently between them, back and forth, in time with their footsteps. The hallway was quiet and full of echoes, their shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor, the trophy cases glinting dully as they passed, the bulletin boards covered in art projects and reminders about picture day. Lily was telling him about the performance, talking a mile a minute the way she did when she was excited, about how nervous she'd been before she went on, about how she'd looked out and found him in his chair like always, about how that had made the nervousness go away. "I always know right where you'll be," she said, swinging the violin case. "Third row, left side, by the aisle," and Daniel laughed and said, "You can count on it, kiddo." And she said, "I know. That's why I never have to be scared." And Daniel had to look up at the ceiling for a moment to keep himself together, because there it was, the answer to every worry he'd ever carried, spoken so simply by an 8-year-old in a recital dress. She knew she could count on him. That was the whole thing. That was everything he had ever wanted to give her, distilled into a single offhand sentence in an empty hallway. They walked on, and Daniel slowed his steps to make the walk last longer, the way he always did, savoring the warmth of her hand in his, the swing of the case between them, the way the amber light wrapped around them both, and the blue shadows kept their distance. He thought about how many of these walks they'd taken over the years, down this very hallway and others like it, after concerts and parent nights and school plays, just the two of them making their way toward the parking lot and the drive home. They were a small procession, a quiet parade of two, and they needed no one else to complete them. The school felt different when it was empty like this, hushed and intimate, as though the building belonged to them alone, as though all the noise and crowd of the daytime had been cleared away just so they could have this peaceful walk together. Lily leaned her head against his arm as they walked, suddenly tired, the way she always crashed after the adrenaline of a performance, and Daniel adjusted his pace to hers and let her lean. "You did so good tonight," he told her softly. "I was the proudest dad in that whole room." And Lily smiled without lifting her head and said, "You're the only dad who sits by himself." And Daniel felt his breath catch, but before he could find words, she added, "But that's okay because you clap the loudest, so it's like you're a whole bunch of people anyway." And Daniel laughed, a real laugh that surprised him with its lightness, and he said, "That's right, I clap loud enough for 10? And she giggled and said, "More like 100. And they walked the rest of the way to the doors, swinging her violin case between them, and laughing softly in the warm, empty hall. And it was, Daniel thought, one of the most perfect moments of his entire life, this ordinary walk down an ordinary hallway with the most extraordinary little person he had ever known. It happened the following week, after Lily's regular lesson at the school, in that same hallway by the music room. Daniel had come to pick her up, as always, and he was standing back near the windows, hands in his pockets, waiting respectfully, the way he always did when Lily's music teacher came out of the room with her. The teacher was a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Alvarez, perhaps in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up into her gray-streaked hair. And Daniel had seen her many times across the auditorium, but had never really spoken with her. Now she knelt down to Lily's level there, in the warm cream light pouring through the tall windows, and she was saying something to her, smiling, her hand gentle on the girl's shoulder. And then she glanced up, past Lily, toward Daniel, with a look of frank curiosity on her face, and she rose and walked toward him. "Excuse me," she said warmly. "You're Lily's father." Daniel nodded, suddenly shy. "Yes, ma'am, Daniel. And Mrs.?" Alvarez smiled and said, "I have to tell you something, Daniel, because I've been wondering about it for a long time now, and I finally just have to ask." And Daniel felt a small clench of worry, the old fear that he had done something wrong, that someone had finally noticed the things he couldn't give. But the teacher's eyes were kind. "I've taught music in this school for 22 years, she said, "and in all that time I have never once seen a parent attend every single performance the way you do. Not once. The little weekday recitals that nobody comes to, the afternoon showcases, the morning assemblies, you're always there. Third row, by the aisle. Alone. And I've watched you, year after year, and I've watched Lily look for you and find you every single time. And I've wondered, who is this man? Who is this father? Who never misses a thing?" Daniel didn't know what to say. His throat had gone tight, and his eyes stung, and he looked down at his shoes. He started, and stopped, and tried again. "She needs to know somebody's there for her, that's all. I didn't have that, growing up. But I used to look out into the crowd and there'd be nobody, and I swore she'd never feel that. That's all it is." Mrs. Alvarez was quiet for a moment, and when Daniel looked up, he saw that her own eyes were shining. She said, "In 22 years, I have seen a lot of talented children come through this room, but the ones who flourish, the ones who really bloom, they almost always have one thing in common. Somebody who shows up, somebody who keeps showing up, even when it's hard, even when no one's watching them do it." And then she said, the thing that undid him. Completely. She said, "Your daughter wrote an essay in my class last month about the person she admires most in the world. And do you know what she wrote about? She wrote about her dad, who sits alone in the third row at every concert, so that she'll always have somebody to play for. She said, "You are the bravest person she knows, because being alone is hard, but you do it anyway, for her." Daniel stood there in the warm cream light, this quiet, weathered man, and the tears spilled over and ran down his face, and he made no move to wipe them away. Across the hall, Lily watched her father cry and did not understand entirely why, but she came and pressed herself against his side, and he put his arm around her. And Mrs. Pratt, Alvarez smiled at the two of them and said softly, "I just wanted you to know that what you do is seen. Even when it feels like it isn't, it's seen." That night, Daniel tucked his daughter into bed the way he did every night, the room glowing in the softest amber lamplight, the shadows warm and gentle in the corners. Lily lay against her pillow, her hair fanned out, her eyes heavy with sleep, and above her, pinned to the curtain where she could see it from her bed, hung the blue ribbon she had won at the spring showcase, turning slightly in the warm air from the heating vent. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the blanket up under her chin and smoothed it down the way he always did, and Lily looked up at him with those wide brown eyes and said, "Daddy, why were you crying today, after my lesson?" And Daniel smiled gently and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and said, "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're happy, baby. Mrs. Alvarez told me something that made me very, very happy." Lily considered this, the way she considered everything, and then she asked, "What did she tell you?" And Daniel looked at his daughter, at this small person he had built his entire life around, and he decided she should hear it from him. "She told me about an essay you wrote," he said softly, "about the person you admire most." Lily's cheeks went pink, and she pulled the blanket up higher, suddenly bashful. "You weren't supposed to know about that," she whispered. "It was supposed to be private." And Daniel laughed quietly and said, "I know, sweetheart, and I'm sorry it got out. But I have to tell you, it was the nicest thing anyone has ever said about me in my whole life." Lily peeked at him over the edge of the blanket and said, "Do you really sit by yourself because of me? So I'll have somebody." And Daniel nodded, his throat tight again. "That's right," he said. "I'd sit in that chair through 100 concerts, 1,000, alone, every single time, as long as it meant you'd never look out and feel like nobody came. You're worth every empty seat in every room in the whole world." And Lily was quiet, and then she reached up her small hand and touched his rough cheek, the way she used to do when she was very little. And she said, "When I grow up and have my own concerts, real big ones, in big fancy places, you'll still sit in the third row by the aisle, won't you?" And Daniel had to take a breath before he could answer, because the thought of it, of her grown and brilliant and on some great stage, undid him with its sweetness. "As long as my legs can carry me there," he said. "Third row, left side, same as always. You look out and I'll be there. I promise." And Lily smiled, satisfied. The deep, contented smile of a child who has never had reason to doubt the most important person in her life, and she let her eyes drift closed. Daniel sat there a moment longer, in the warm amber glow, watching her breathe, watching the blue ribbon turn gently above her head, feeling the quiet of the house settle around them both like a blessing. He thought about the long road that had brought them here, the fear and the loneliness and the endless tired evenings, the 1,000 small sacrifices no one ever saw, and he thought about Mrs. Marr. Alvarez kneeling in the hallway, telling him that what he did was seen, even when it felt like it wasn't. He had never needed to be seen, he realized. He had only needed Lily to feel held. But to know, after all these years, that someone had noticed, that his quiet faithfulness had not been invisible after all, that his daughter had grown into a child who could write about a father's love and understand its weight, that was a gift he had never thought to ask for. He leaned down and kissed her forehead and whispered, "Good night, my whole heart," and he turned off the lamp, and in the soft darkness he sat for one more moment beside the sleeping girl who had given his life its meaning, the silent dad who had simply, faithfully against everything, stayed.